Or are you just being
I
general?
apologize that I am toxic to you, Mary, or was toxic to you.
Welcome back to The Life with the Browns. There are moments in reality television that feel carefully scripted, polished for the audience, and designed to maintain a certain illusion, but then there are moments like this one. A quiet dinner, two people sitting across from each other, and a conversation that slowly unravels into something deeply uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. What started as a calm exchange quickly revealed cracks that had clearly been forming for years. The words spoken weren't just casual thoughts. They carried weight, tension, and a kind of honesty that felt almost too raw for television. As Kody leaned in, speaking about something special between them, there was an underlying hesitation, like even he knew what he was about to say would shift everything. Robyn's responses, soft and uncertain, only added to the tension. She agreed, but her agreement felt cautious, almost rehearsed, as if she was trying to keep the peace rather than express how she truly felt. The atmosphere wasn't warm or romantic, it was heavy, filled with unspoken fears and fragile reassurances. And right there, in that moment, viewers could sense that this wasn't just a conversation about love or connection. It was something deeper, something more unsettling, a glimpse into a relationship that was no longer as stable as it once appeared. As the conversation unfolded, the tone shifted from reflective to revealing in a way that no one could have expected. Kody began questioning the very foundation of what they had built, asking why they wouldn't risk something wonderful unless there was a guarantee. That word, guarantee, hung in the air like a warning. Relationships aren't built on guarantees, and yet here he was, framing their entire connection around the idea that it might not be enough. Robyn tried to follow his logic, nodding along, but there was a visible discomfort in her reactions. She wasn't fully agreeing, she was adapting, adjusting, trying to stay aligned with him even as the conversation became increasingly difficult. And then came the moment that changed everything. Kody admitted that there might be something he wanted more, something beyond what they currently had. It wasn't said loudly or dramatically, but its impact was immediate. The subtext was clear: what they shared, what she had believed in for years, might no longer satisfy him. That realization didn't just create tension, it shattered the illusion of certainty that had defined their relationship for so long. What makes this moment even more shocking is that it wasn't hidden. This wasn't a private conversation accidentally caught on camera. This was filmed, intentional, and fully visible to the world. Kody knew he was being watched, yet he chose to reveal a side of himself that contradicted everything he had previously claimed. For years, he had presented himself as someone who had moved beyond the complexities of plural marriage, someone who had found peace and fulfillment in a single, committed relationship. He spoke confidently about being content, about no longer needing the dynamic that once defined his life. But this dinner exposed a completely different reality. Beneath the surface, there was restlessness, dissatisfaction, and a desire that he could no longer, or perhaps no longer wanted to, hide. The contrast between his public persona and this private truth was impossible to ignore. It raised questions not just about his intentions, but about the authenticity of everything he had said before. Welcome back to The Life with the Browns. There are moments in reality television that feel carefully scripted, polished for the audience, and designed to maintain a certain illusion, but then there are moments like this one. A quiet dinner, two people sitting across from each other, and a conversation that slowly unravels into something deeply uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. What started as a calm exchange quickly revealed cracks that had clearly been forming for years. The words spoken weren't just casual thoughts. They carried weight, tension, and a kind of honesty that felt almost too raw for television. As Kody leaned in, speaking about something special between them, there was an underlying hesitation, like even he knew what he was about to say would shift everything. Robyn's responses, soft and uncertain, only added to the tension. She agreed, but her agreement felt cautious, almost rehearsed, as if she was trying to keep the peace rather than express how she truly felt. The atmosphere wasn't warm or romantic, it was heavy, filled with unspoken fears and fragile reassurances. And right there, in that moment, viewers could sense that this wasn't just a conversation about love or connection. It was something deeper, something more unsettling, a glimpse into a relationship that was no longer as stable as it once appeared. As the conversation unfolded, the tone shifted from reflective to revealing in a way that no one could have expected. Kody began questioning the very foundation of what they had built, asking why they wouldn't risk something wonderful unless there was a guarantee. That word, guarantee, hung in the air like a warning. Relationships aren't built on guarantees, and yet here he was, framing their entire connection around the idea that it might not be enough. Robyn tried to follow his logic, nodding along, but there was a visible discomfort in her reactions. She wasn't fully agreeing. She was adapting, adjusting, trying to stay aligned with him even as the conversation became increasingly difficult. And then came the moment that changed everything. Kody admitted that there might be something he wanted more, something beyond what they currently had. It wasn't said loudly or dramatically, but its impact was immediate. The subtext was clear. What they shared, what she had believed in for years, might no longer satisfy him. That realization didn't just create tension, it shattered the illusion of certainty that had defined their relationship for so long. What makes this moment even more shocking is that it wasn't hidden. This wasn't a private conversation accidentally caught on camera. This was filmed, intentional, and fully visible to the world. Kody knew he was being watched, yet he chose to reveal a side of himself that contradicted everything he had previously claimed. For years, he had presented himself as someone who had moved beyond the complexities of plural marriage, someone who had found peace and fulfillment in a single, committed relationship. He spoke confidently about being content, about no longer needing the dynamic that once defined his life. But this dinner exposed a completely different reality. Beneath the surface, there was restlessness, dissatisfaction, and a desire that he could no longer, or perhaps no longer wanted to, hide. The contrast between his public persona and this private truth was impossible to ignore. It raised questions not just about his intentions, but about the authenticity of everything he had said before. What makes this entire situation even more unsettling isn't just what was said at that dinner table, it's what it reveals about everything that came before it. For years, viewers were led to believe that Kody had finally found peace, that after all the chaos, heartbreak, and fractured relationships, he had settled into a life that felt stable and complete. He spoke about loyalty, about choosing one path, about being fulfilled in a way he never had been before. But now, sitting across from Robyn, those words feel hollow, almost like a script he outgrew, but forgot to stop performing. Because in this moment, there's no trace of that certainty. Instead, there's restlessness in his tone, a subtle dissatisfaction that keeps creeping into his sentences, and a mindset that suggests he's already looking beyond what he has. And the most striking part is how casually he introduces it, as if questioning the entire foundation of their relationship is just another normal conversation. As he continues to talk, you can see the shift happening right in front of you. He starts by acknowledging something special, something rare and meaningful, but almost immediately, he begins to dismantle it. That contradiction is what makes his words so powerful and so damaging at the same time. He builds something up just enough to make it feel valuable, then slowly chips away at it until it feels uncertain again. And Robyn, sitting there, becomes caught in that cycle. She agrees with him, supports him, follows his lead, but every agreement seems to pull her deeper into a conversation that isn't really in her favor. Because while she's affirming their bond, he's questioning whether that bond is enough. And that imbalance creates a kind of emotional tension that's impossible to ignore. There's also something deeply revealing about the way Kody frames his thoughts. He doesn't present his doubts as problems within himself. Instead, he presents them as logical concerns, almost like he's analyzing a situation rather than participating in it. He talks about risk, about guarantees, about what might or might not be enough, as if love can be measured or secured like a contract. That way of thinking strips the relationship of its emotional core and turns it into something transactional. And in doing so, it places Robyn in a difficult position. Because how do you respond to someone who isn't speaking from emotion, but from calculation? How do you defend something that's being questioned not with feelings, but with logic that feels detached and almost clinical? Robyn's reactions, once again, tell a story of their own. She doesn't interrupt him. She doesn't challenge him directly. Instead, she mirrors his tone, trying to stay aligned with his perspective even as it becomes more unsettling. There's a moment where she hesitates, where her response feels delayed, like she's processing what he just said while also deciding how to respond in a way that won't escalate the situation. And that hesitation speaks volumes. It suggests that this isn't new territory for her, that she's navigated conversations like this before, and that she's learned, consciously or not, how to manage them in a way that keeps things from falling apart completely. But beneath that calm surface, there's an undeniable tension building. Because the more Kody talks, the clearer it becomes that this isn't just about hypothetical concerns. This is about desire, about dissatisfaction, and about the possibility of change. And even though he doesn't say everything outright, the implications are there, lingering between his words. He's not just questioning the present, he's hinting at a future that may not include the same level of commitment, the same sense of exclusivity, or even the same priorities that once defined their relationship. And that kind of uncertainty doesn't just create discomfort, it creates instability. What's particularly striking is how normalized this dynamic seems to be between them. There's no dramatic confrontation, no explosive reaction. Instead, there's a quiet acceptance, a kind of unspoken agreement to continue the conversation even as it becomes more uncomfortable. And that normalization is what makes it so powerful. Because it suggests that this isn't an isolated moment, it's part of a pattern, a way of communicating that has likely been repeated over time. A pattern where one person introduces doubt and the other adapts to it, where difficult truths are softened rather than confronted, and where the real issues remain just beneath the surface, never fully addressed. As the conversation moves forward, the emotional weight of it becomes harder to ignore. Every sentence feels like it's adding another layer to an already complex situation. And while Kody continues to speak in a way that feels controlled and deliberate, there's an underlying intensity that keeps pushing through. It's as if he's trying to justify something, not just to Robyn, but to himself. Trying to make sense of feelings that don't align with the narrative he's been presenting for so long. And in that process, he ends up revealing more than he might have intended. For Robyn, this moment becomes a kind of turning point, even if it's not immediately obvious. Because while she continues to engage in the conversation, to respond and adapt, there's a growing sense that something has shifted. That the certainty she once relied on is no longer as solid as it seemed. And even if she doesn't fully confront that realization in the moment, it's there, shaping the way she listens, the way she responds, and the way she processes what's being said. And for the audience, this scene offers something rare, a glimpse into the reality behind the narrative. Not the polished version, not the carefully constructed story, but the raw, unfiltered truth of a relationship that's evolving in ways that aren't entirely clear, even to the people involved. It raises questions about authenticity, about intention, and about what happens when the story you've been telling no longer matches the reality you're living. And as that gap continues to widen, one thing becomes certain: whatever comes next, it will be shaped by the truth that was revealed in this moment, whether they're ready to face it or not. By the time this conversation reaches its most revealing point, it's no longer just uncomfortable, it's deeply exposing. What started as a quiet exchange about something special has now turned into a moment where Kody begins to drop the mask entirely. There's no more careful wording, no more vague hints. Instead, there's a level of honesty that feels almost shocking, not because it's refreshing, but because of how raw and unfiltered it is. He leans into his thoughts with a kind of confidence that suggests he's no longer interested in protecting the image he once worked so hard to maintain. And in doing so, he reveals something that completely changes the way this relationship is understood. When Kody admits that there's something he wants, something he believes he may want more than Robyn does, it lands with a weight that's impossible to ignore. This isn't a passing comment. It's a declaration, one that immediately shifts the power dynamic of the conversation. Because now, it's not just about what they share, it's about what he feels he's missing. And instead of exploring that gap with care or sensitivity, he presents it almost as a fact, something that exists whether she's comfortable with it or not. That kind of honesty, delivered without cushioning, doesn't just create tension, it creates distance. What follows is even more revealing. As Robyn tries to keep the conversation grounded, trying to focus on what they have in the present, Kody continues to push beyond it. He doesn't settle into the reassurance she's offering. Instead, he keeps reaching for something else, something undefined, but clearly important to him. And that persistence tells its own story. It suggests that whatever dissatisfaction he's feeling isn't temporary. It's not something that will fade with time or be resolved through conversation. It's something deeper, something that has likely been building for a while, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be ignored. Robyn's attempt to anchor the moment, sit here in this truth we have, feels almost like a plea, a quiet effort to bring things back to something stable. But even that isn't enough to hold the conversation in place. Because while she's focused on preserving what exists, Kody is already looking beyond it. And that difference in perspective creates a gap that's hard to bridge. One person is trying to protect the present, while the other is already questioning its value. And when those two positions collide, the result isn't resolution, it's uncertainty. There's also something deeply telling about the way Kody compares this relationship to his past. When he says he couldn't find this kind of connection with the others, not even with Janelle, it's framed as a compliment, but it carries an underlying implication. It reinforces the idea that relationships, in his view, are constantly being evaluated, compared, and measured. And while that might seem like a way of validating Robyn's importance, it also introduces a kind of instability. Because if he could once look at his previous relationships and decide they weren't enough, what's stopping him from doing the same again? This is where the conversation begins to take on a more unsettling tone. It's no longer just about dissatisfaction, it's about the possibility of replacement. Not in a direct, explicit way, but in a way that lingers beneath the surface. The idea that what they have might not be enough opens the door to something else, something new, something that could fill whatever gap he believes exists. And even if that possibility isn't fully explored in this moment, its presence is enough to change everything. What makes this even more complex is the way Kody presents his thoughts as something almost inevitable. He doesn't frame them as choices or desires that can be managed or controlled. Instead, they come across as needs, something fundamental, something that exists beyond his control. And that framing shifts the responsibility away from him and onto the situation itself. It's not that he wants something different, it's that he feels compelled to want it. And that distinction, subtle as it may be, has a powerful impact on how the conversation unfolds. For Robyn, this creates an incredibly difficult position. Because how do you respond to something that's being presented as unavoidable? How do you argue against a feeling that's being framed as a necessity? Her responses remain calm, measured, but there's an underlying tension that continues to build. She's listening, processing, trying to understand, but at the same time, she's being asked to accept something that directly challenges her sense of security in the relationship. As the moment continues, it becomes clear that this isn't just a conversation about feelings, it's a revelation of priorities. And those priorities don't align in the way they once seemed to. Where Robyn is focused on connection, on preserving what they've built, Kody is focused on something else entirely, something that extends beyond the boundaries of their current relationship. And that divergence doesn't just create tension, it creates a fundamental shift in how their relationship can be understood moving forward. For viewers, this is the moment where everything clicks into place. The inconsistencies, the subtle hints, the underlying tension that's been present for so long, it all becomes clearer. Because what's being revealed here isn't just a temporary conflict. It's a deeper truth about how Kody views relationships, about what he values, and about the way those values continue to evolve over time. And once that truth is out in the open, it's impossible to ignore. By the end of this exchange, one thing becomes undeniable. The dynamic between them has changed. Whether they acknowledge it directly or not, the foundation they've been relying on is no longer as stable as it once was. And while the conversation may come to a pause, the questions it raises don't go away. They linger, shaping everything that comes next and leaving both Robyn and the audience wondering just how far this shift will go. By this point in the conversation, What once felt like a subtle tension has fully transformed into something far more unsettling. The tone is no longer cautious or exploratory. It's direct, unapologetic, and almost shockingly blunt. Kody is no longer circling around his thoughts or softening his words. Instead, he leans into them with a confidence that feels both deliberate and revealing. And it's in this moment that the true nature of what he's been hinting at begins to surface in a way that changes everything. Because now, it's not just about emotional gaps or uncertainty. It's about desire, and more specifically, the kind of desire that strips away any illusion of deeper meaning. When the conversation turns toward physical attraction and personal wants, the shift is immediate and undeniable. There's no longer any attempt to frame things in terms of connection, growth, or shared purpose. Instead, the focus becomes strikingly surface level, centered on appearance, satisfaction, and the idea of wanting something more, not emotionally, but physically. And the way Kody expresses this isn't hesitant or conflicted. It's matter-of-fact, almost casual, as if discussing something entirely reasonable. But that's exactly what makes it so jarring. Because in reducing the conversation to these terms, he's not just revealing his perspective, he's redefining the entire foundation of what their relationship has been built on. Robyn's reaction in this moment is telling, but also deeply layered. When she calls him out, even lightly, there's a brief glimpse of awareness, a recognition that what he's saying crosses a line. But that moment doesn't expand into a full confrontation. Instead, it's quickly softened, almost brushed aside, as if acknowledging the discomfort is enough without actually addressing it. And that response creates a kind of emotional dissonance. Because on one hand, she clearly understands the implications of what he's saying. But on the other, she doesn't fully challenge it. She allows the conversation to continue, even as it becomes more uncomfortable, more revealing, and more difficult to ignore. What makes this exchange particularly striking is the complete absence of hesitation on Kody's part. When confronted, even subtly, he doesn't backtrack or attempt to reframe his words. Instead, he doubles down, reinforcing his perspective with a kind of blunt honesty that leaves no room for misinterpretation. There's no attempt to protect Robyn's feelings, no effort to soften the impact of what he's saying. And that lack of sensitivity speaks volumes. Because it suggests that, in this moment, being understood, or perhaps simply being honest, is more important to him than maintaining emotional harmony. As the conversation continues, the imbalance between them becomes even more pronounced. Robyn is reacting, adjusting, trying to navigate what's being said. Kody, on the other hand, is leading, setting the tone, and pushing the conversation in a direction that feels increasingly one-sided. And that dynamic creates a sense of pressure, a feeling that Robyn is being pulled into a narrative that she didn't initiate and may not fully agree with. She's being asked, not directly, but implicitly, to accept a version of reality that challenges her role, her value, and her place within the relationship. There's also something deeply revealing about the way Kody frames his desires. He doesn't present them as something that could be worked through or addressed within the relationship. Instead, they come across as external needs, something that exists outside of what Robyn can provide. And that framing is significant, because it shifts the conversation from one about growth or compromise to one about limitation. It suggests that no matter what Robyn does, there may always be something missing, something beyond her control. And that implication carries a weight that's hard to ignore. For Robyn, this creates an incredibly complex emotional space. On the surface, she remains composed, engaged in the conversation, responding in a way that keeps things moving forward. But beneath that surface, there's a growing tension, a sense that the ground beneath her is shifting. Because what she's hearing isn't just about Kody's thoughts, it's about her place in his life, about whether what she offers is enough, and about what the future of their relationship might look like if these feelings continue to grow. What makes this moment even more impactful is the contrast between what's being said now and what has been said in the past. The certainty, the commitment, the sense of finality that once defined their relationship feels distant, almost disconnected from this current reality. And that contrast doesn't just create confusion, it creates doubt. Because if the narrative has changed this dramatically, it raises questions about what was real to begin with and what might continue to change moving forward. As viewers watch this unfold, there's a growing sense that this isn't just a conversation, it's a turning point. A moment where the underlying truths of the relationship are no longer hidden beneath layers of reassurance and public image. Instead, they're being brought to the surface, exposed in a way that forces both Robyn and the audience to confront them directly. And once those truths are out in the open, they can't simply be ignored or undone. By the end of this exchange, the emotional landscape has shifted in a way that feels both subtle and profound. Nothing has been officially decided, no clear conclusions have been reached, but the implications are undeniable. The questions raised in this moment will linger, shaping every interaction that follows and redefining how this relationship is understood. Because when the foundation of something is questioned this openly, this directly, it doesn't just create tension, it changes everything that comes after it. At this stage of the conversation, what we're witnessing no longer feels like a simple disagreement or even a moment of uncomfortable honesty. It feels like a pattern fully revealing itself. The tension that started as subtle has now settled into something much heavier, something that doesn't just exist in this one dinner scene, but seems to stretch across years of interactions, decisions, and emotional exchanges. Kody isn't just expressing a passing thought anymore. He's reinforcing a mindset, one that places his needs, his desires, and his perspective at the center of everything. And what makes this so striking is how normalized it appears to be within the dynamic of their relationship. There's a rhythm to the way he speaks now, a kind of repetition that suggests this isn't the first time these ideas have been brought up. He builds something up, talks about connection, about something rare and meaningful, and then, almost without pause, introduces doubt. It's a cycle that keeps repeating itself, and each time it does, it chips away at the sense of stability that should exist in a relationship. Robyn is left in a position where she has to constantly reevaluate where she stands, where she has to keep proving that what she offers is enough, even when the standard itself keeps shifting. And that constant movement creates a kind of emotional exhaustion that isn't always visible, but is definitely present. What's particularly revealing in this moment is how little resistance Kody encounters. Not because Robyn agrees with everything he's saying, but because she doesn't fully push back against it. Her responses remain measured, careful, almost strategic. It's as if she's trying to navigate the conversation without triggering something more intense, without escalating the situation into a confrontation that could spiral out of control. And while that approach might maintain a surface-level calm, it also allows the underlying issues to remain unchallenged. The imbalance continues, and with it, the sense that one voice carries more weight than the other. Kody, on the other hand, seems increasingly comfortable in this space. The more he speaks, the more confident he becomes in expressing thoughts that, at one point, might have been considered too harsh or too revealing. There's a kind of detachment in the way he talks about the relationship, as if he's analyzing it from the outside rather than experiencing it from within. He doesn't appear weighed down by the emotional impact of his words. Instead, he presents them almost like conclusions, things he's already decided, rather than questions he's still exploring. And that shift from uncertainty to certainty makes the conversation feel less like a dialogue and more like a declaration. This is where the dynamic begins to feel particularly one-sided. Because while Robyn is still engaging, still responding, the direction of the conversation is no longer mutual. It's being driven by Kody's perspective, shaped by his priorities, and framed in a way that leaves little room for alternative viewpoints. And that kind of dynamic doesn't just affect the conversation, it affects the relationship as a whole. It creates a structure where one person defines the terms and the other is left to adapt to them. There's also something deeply telling about the lack of emotional acknowledgement in this moment. Kody speaks openly about what he wants, about what he feels might be missing, but there's very little recognition of how those statements might be affecting Robyn. There's no pause to check in, no moment of reflection where he considers the impact of his words. And that absence speaks volumes. Because it suggests that the conversation isn't about mutual understanding, it's about expression, about stating a position without necessarily considering the consequences. For Robyn, This creates a quiet but significant shift. Even if she doesn't fully express it, there's a sense that she's beginning to understand the reality of the situation in a deeper way. The reassurances she once relied on are no longer present in the same way. The certainty she may have felt before is being replaced by something far less stable. And while she continues to engage in the conversation, there's an underlying awareness that things are changing, that the relationship she thought she had may not be as secure as it once seemed. What makes this moment even more impactful is how it reframes everything that came before it. The past conversations, the public statements, the image that was presented to the world, all of it now feels like it needs to be reconsidered. Because if this is the reality behind the scenes, then the narrative that was shared publicly may not have been entirely accurate. And that realization doesn't just affect how the present is viewed, it changes how the entire history of the relationship is understood. As the conversation continues, there's a growing sense that this isn't leading toward resolution. There's no clear path forward, no moment where everything clicks into place and the tension is resolved. Instead, there's a lingering uncertainty, a feeling that the questions being raised don't have immediate answers. And that uncertainty is perhaps the most powerful element of all, because it leaves both Robyn and the audience in a space where nothing feels fully settled, where the future of the relationship is open, but not in a reassuring way. By the end of this moment, one thing becomes increasingly clear. This isn't just about what's being said, it's about what it represents. A shift in priorities, a change in perspective, and a dynamic that is no longer as balanced as it once appeared. And while the conversation itself may come to a pause, the implications of it will continue to unfold, shaping everything that happens next in ways that are still impossible to fully predict. At this point, the conversation isn't just revealing, it's exposing a cycle that has been quietly repeating itself for years, only now it's impossible to ignore. What we're watching is no longer about one uncomfortable dinner or one shocking statement. It's about a pattern of behavior that feels deeply ingrained, almost rehearsed, as if Kody has navigated these emotional dynamics so many times before that they've become second nature. The way he builds up connection only to question it moments later, the way he introduces doubt while maintaining control of the narrative, it all points to something much bigger than this single interaction. And the most unsettling part is how seamlessly it all unfolds, like a script that's been perfected over time. There's a certain confidence in Kody's tone now that wasn't as obvious at the beginning of the conversation. He's no longer testing the waters or carefully choosing his words. Instead, he's leaning into them fully, almost as if he expects them to be accepted without resistance. And in many ways, they are. Because while Robyn is clearly processing everything he's saying, she's still responding in a way that keeps the conversation moving rather than challenging its direction. That dynamic, where one person asserts and the other adapts, creates a kind of imbalance that becomes more pronounced with every passing moment. What's particularly striking is how Kody frames his perspective as something almost inevitable. He doesn't present his desires as choices that can be questioned or worked through. Instead, they come across as needs, as if they exist beyond his control and therefore beyond criticism. That framing shifts the entire tone of the conversation. Because if something is presented as a need rather than a want, it becomes much harder to argue against. It places Robyn in a position where disagreement could be interpreted as misunderstanding, rather than a valid response to something that directly affects her. And yet, despite the weight of what's being said, there's a noticeable lack of emotional accountability. Kody speaks openly, even bluntly, about what he feels is missing, but there's very little acknowledgement of how those statements might be affecting Robyn. There's no pause to consider her perspective, no moment where he checks in to see how she's processing everything. It's as if the conversation exists solely as a space for him to express himself, rather than a shared dialogue where both voices carry equal importance. And that absence of balance is what makes the entire exchange feel so one-sided. Robyn's role in this moment becomes increasingly complex. On the surface, she remains composed, engaged, and responsive. But beneath that surface, there's a growing sense that she's navigating something much more difficult than she's letting on. Her responses are careful, measured, almost as if she's choosing her words not just based on what she feels, but on what will keep the situation from escalating. And that kind of restraint suggests a deeper awareness, an understanding that pushing back too hard might lead to consequences she's trying to avoid. There's also an element of adaptation in the way she engages with him. Instead of directly opposing his perspective, she adjusts to it, trying to find common ground even when the foundation of that ground feels unstable. And while that approach might maintain a sense of calm in the moment, it also reinforces the dynamic where Kody's perspective sets the tone. Over time, that kind of dynamic can reshape a relationship in subtle but significant ways, shifting it from a partnership into something that feels more like a negotiation. As the conversation continues, it becomes clear that this isn't leading toward a resolution, it's leading toward a realization. Not necessarily one that's fully acknowledged in the moment, but one that's quietly taking shape beneath the surface. Because the more Kody speaks, the more he reveals about how he views the relationship, about what he values, and about what he feels is missing. And those revelations don't just add to the conversation, they redefine it. For the audience, this moment offers a level of clarity that hasn't been present before. The inconsistencies, the subtle hints, the underlying tension that's been building over time, it all starts to make sense in a new way. Because what's being revealed here isn't just a temporary conflict. It's a deeper truth about the dynamic between them, about the way communication happens, and about the imbalance that exists beneath the surface of what once appeared to be a stable relationship. What makes this realization so powerful is that it doesn't come with a clear solution. There's no immediate resolution, no moment where everything is addressed and fixed. Instead, there's a lingering uncertainty, a sense that something fundamental has shifted and that it can't simply be undone. And that uncertainty creates a kind of tension that extends beyond the conversation itself, shaping how everything that follows will be interpreted. By the end of this moment, one thing becomes undeniable. This isn't just a conversation, it's a reflection of a deeper reality. A reality where one person's needs are beginning to outweigh the shared foundation of the relationship, and where the balance that once held everything together is starting to tilt in a way that may be difficult to correct. And as that realization settles in, both Robyn and the audience are left facing the same question: what happens next when the truth is no longer something that can be ignored? By now, the emotional weight of this conversation has settled into something undeniable. This isn't just tension, it's transformation. What we're witnessing is the moment where a relationship stops being what it once was and starts becoming something else entirely. And the most unsettling part is that this shift isn't loud or explosive. It's quiet, subtle, almost controlled. But beneath that calm surface, everything is changing. Kody isn't just expressing dissatisfaction anymore, he's redefining expectations. And in doing so, he's forcing Robyn into a position where she has to either adapt to those new expectations or risk losing the stability she thought she had. There's a noticeable shift in how Kody carries himself during this stage of the conversation. He no longer seems concerned with how his words might land. There's a kind of emotional detachment in his delivery, as if he's already processed these thoughts internally and is now simply presenting them as facts. That detachment creates distance, not just in the conversation, but in the relationship itself. Because when one person speaks from a place of certainty while the other is still trying to process what's happening, the gap between them becomes impossible to ignore. And that gap is exactly where uncertainty begins to grow. What makes this moment even more complex is the way Kody subtly shifts responsibility. He doesn't directly blame Robyn, but the implications of his words suggest that something is lacking, something that isn't being fulfilled. And even without saying it outright, that suggestion carries weight. It places Robyn in a position where she has to question herself, where she has to wonder whether she's meeting expectations that are no longer clearly defined. And that kind of ambiguity can be incredibly destabilizing because it creates a moving target, one that's nearly impossible to hit consistently. Robyn, on the other hand, continues to respond with a kind of quiet resilience. She doesn't break down, she doesn't lash out. Instead, she stays present in the conversation, even as it becomes increasingly uncomfortable. But there's a difference now. Earlier, her responses felt like an attempt to maintain harmony. Now, they feel more like an effort to understand what's happening, to make sense of a situation that no longer fits the narrative she believed in. And that shift from maintaining to understanding is subtle, but significant. There's also a growing sense that this isn't just about the present moment, it's about the future. Every statement Kody makes seems to point forward, toward possibilities that extend beyond their current reality. And while those possibilities aren't fully defined, their presence alone is enough to change the tone of the conversation. Because once the idea of something more is introduced, it becomes impossible to ignore. It lingers in the background, influencing every word, every response, every moment of silence. What's particularly striking is how normalized this dynamic appears to be for both of them. There's no dramatic confrontation, no clear breaking point. Instead, there's a kind of acceptance, an unspoken agreement to continue navigating the conversation even as it becomes more difficult. And that normalization is what makes the situation so complex. Because when something becomes normalized, it stops feeling unusual, even if it's deeply problematic. It becomes part of the routine, part of the pattern, part of the relationship itself. As the conversation continues, the imbalance between them becomes even more apparent. Kody leads, sets the tone, introduces new ideas. Robyn follows, responds, adjusts. And while that dynamic may have existed before, it feels more pronounced now, more significant. Because the stakes have changed. This isn't just about maintaining a relationship, it's about redefining it. And in that process, the question of who holds the power becomes impossible to ignore. For the audience, this moment offers a kind of clarity that's both revealing and unsettling. The pieces start to come together in a way that makes the bigger picture impossible to ignore. The past, the patterns, the subtle hints that something wasn't quite right, they all begin to align with what's being shown now. And that alignment creates a deeper understanding of the relationship, one that goes beyond surface-level interactions and into the underlying dynamics that have been shaping everything from the beginning. But with that clarity comes a new set of questions. Because understanding what's happening doesn't automatically provide a solution. It doesn't tell us what Robyn will do, or how Kody's perspective will evolve, or whether this relationship can adapt to the changes that are unfolding. Instead, it leaves us in a space of uncertainty, a space where the future feels open, but not necessarily stable. By the end of this moment, one thing is clear: the relationship we thought we understood is no longer the same. The foundation has shifted, the expectations have changed, and the dynamic between them is evolving in ways that can't be easily reversed. And as that reality settles in, both Robyn and the audience are left with the same lingering thought. When everything starts to change this quietly, how long does it take before the change becomes impossible to ignore? At this stage, the conversation has moved far beyond discomfort. It has entered a space where the emotional consequences can no longer be ignored. What once felt like subtle tension has now become a clear shift in power, intention, and direction. Kody isn't just questioning the relationship anymore. He's reshaping it in real time, redefining what it means, what it requires, and most importantly, what it lacks. And the way he does it is so calm, so controlled, that it almost disguises the magnitude of what's actually happening. But make no mistake, this is the moment where everything starts to fracture beneath the surface. There's something particularly striking about how casual Kody's delivery remains, even as the weight of his words grows heavier. He speaks as if he's simply sharing thoughts, as if this is just another conversation between two people trying to figure things out. But the reality is far more complex. Because what he's really doing is introducing a new narrative, one where the relationship they've built is no longer enough on its own. And that narrative doesn't just exist in theory. It carries real implications, real consequences, and a very real sense of instability that Robyn is now being forced to confront. What makes this moment even more intense is the way Kody subtly positions himself as someone who is being honest, even brave, for saying these things out loud. There's an unspoken suggestion that expressing these desires, no matter how uncomfortable they are, is somehow a form of transparency, a sign of authenticity. But that framing shifts the focus away from the impact of his words and onto the act of saying them. It creates a situation where the conversation becomes less about how Robyn feels and more about how openly Kody is expressing himself. And that imbalance once again reinforces the dynamic where his perspective takes priority. Robyn's reaction, while still composed, begins to carry a different kind of energy. There's a quiet tension in the way she responds now, a subtle shift that suggests she's no longer just trying to maintain harmony, she's trying to understand the full scope of what's being said. Because at this point, it's no longer possible to dismiss his words as hypothetical or abstract. They are direct, intentional, and loaded with meaning. And even though she doesn't fully confront him, there's a growing awareness in her responses, a sense that she's beginning to see the situation for what it really is. One of the most revealing aspects of this moment is how little room there is for Robyn's perspective to truly shape the conversation. She speaks, she responds, she engages, but the direction never really changes. Kody continues to guide the narrative, to introduce new ideas, to expand on his thoughts without fully pausing to absorb hers. And that creates a dynamic where her voice, while present, doesn't carry the same influence. It becomes reactive rather than proactive, supportive rather than equal. And over time, that kind of imbalance can redefine the entire structure of a relationship. There's also a deeper layer to what's happening here, one that goes beyond the words themselves. It's about what those words represent. The shift from emotional connection to physical desire, from shared meaning to individual fulfillment, from partnership to personal satisfaction. These aren't small changes. They represent a fundamental transformation in how the relationship is being viewed and valued. And once that shift begins, it's incredibly difficult to reverse. Because it changes not just what is expected, but what is prioritized. For Robyn, this creates a moment of quiet reckoning. Even if she doesn't fully express it, there's a sense that she's beginning to realize the implications of what's being said. That the relationship she believed in, the stability she thought she had, may not be as secure as it once seemed. And that realization doesn't come with immediate answers. It doesn't tell her what to do or how to respond. It simply exists, creating a tension that will likely continue to grow long after this conversation ends. As viewers, we're witnessing something that feels both intimate and unsettling. This isn't just drama, it's a glimpse into the mechanics of a relationship that is actively shifting in front of us. The power dynamics, the communication patterns, the underlying priorities, they're all being laid bare in a way that leaves very little to interpretation. And that level of clarity, while valuable, also comes with a certain discomfort. Because it forces us to confront the reality of what's happening rather than the version of it that may have been easier to accept before. By the end of this moment, the conversation has reached a point where it can't simply be brushed aside or forgotten. The things that have been said carry weight, and that weight will follow them into whatever comes next. Whether it leads to change, confrontation, or further silence remains to be seen. But one thing is certain. The dynamic between Kody and Robyn has shifted in a way that feels both significant and irreversible. And as that realization settles in, it leaves behind a question that lingers long after the scene fades. When the truth finally surfaces like this, what happens to everything that was built on the version of the story that came before it? By the time we reach this point, the weight of everything that's been said isn't just sitting in the air. It's settled deep into the foundation of the relationship itself. This is no longer about a single conversation or a series of uncomfortable admissions. This is about consequences. Real, unavoidable consequences that come from speaking truths that can't be taken back. Kody has crossed a line that changes how everything before this moment is interpreted and how everything after it will unfold. Because once you openly question the value of what you have, once you suggest that it might not be enough, you don't just create tension, you create a fracture. What's most striking now is how irreversible this feels. There's no easy way to rewind, no simple explanation that can soften what's already been said. Even if the conversation were to shift, even if Kody were